Hi everyone. Welcome to the second of our two virtual lectures here today. Of course, we're going to be talking about the wrist and hand. Last week and in the previous weeks, one of the biggest things that we've been talking about is the differentiation between the mobility of certain joints versus the stability of others, and the transitional aspect of all these other joints that we've kind of been going over. So, I mean, today we're going to have a different theme for the wrist and hand as opposed to the other ones. I know in last week's lecture that you all, I hope, watched, we talked about, these muscles that we're going to be talking about today. We talked about these a lot, or at least referred to them quite a bit throughout that particular lecture. So today we're actually going to get into a little bit more of the specifics about those. So to kind of start off, like I said, one of the things that, we've done throughout the arm portions of this semester, the upper extremity portions, we think about the difference between stability and mobility, and where coordination comes into play, and where transitional aspects come into play. So as we've spoken about, the shoulder had a ton of different motions that it was capable of doing. It can do 8 different motions, and if you include circumduction, there's a 9th motion that it's capable of doing as well. Because of that, one of the things that we see is all that stability means that there's not a lot of mobility. So when we look at the chance of injury, a lot of times the injury risks that happen there are more about dislocations and different instability type injuries. When we take a look at the elbow, on the other hand, as we've talked about last week, we see that as soon as the elbow fully extends, it kind of locks itself into place, and it really gets this supreme level of stability in that particular sense. But as a consequence, what we know that is that it didn't give us a ton of mobility, right? There was really only 2 motions that the elbow itself was capable of doing. When we get into the wrist and hand, though, the conversation kind of has to change a little bit, because now we're talking about coordination. We're talking about how all of these muscles that come and control all of our fingers, the muscles in our palms, our wrist, and all the different motions that it's capable of doing as well. When we take a look at all of these different motions, each joint, we really could analyze each joint and say whether or not that joint is mobile versus stable, or whatever the case may be. But the theme of this, especially because of the amount of bones and the size of each one of those bones, is more talking about the level of coordination that has to come into this. So again, if we talked about the theme of the shoulder, it was stability. The theme of the shoulder was mobility. The theme of the elbow was stability. The theme of the wrist and hand is more about coordination. You can take a look at the bottom of this slide here, and you can see all the different hand motions that we can do. And this is just a very small fraction of everything that our hands are capable of doing. And we think about all the bones that have to take place. Think about all the different muscles that have to take place to be able to get us into all of these really strange, but at times very functional motions of the hand. So that's what we're going to be getting into. We're going to be talking toward the end of the lecture today about how the nerves really come in and play with this. But we're going to talk mainly about, of course, as we've done, the bones, the joints, the muscles. And today, like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about the nerves at the end there as well. So when we talk about the bony anatomy of the hand, we think about you see all the different bones. As we talked about in one of the first lessons of this semester, one of the first things that we talked about is the fact that more than 25% of all of the bones in our body are contained within our hands and within our feet. If we combine all of those, each one of our hands, we can see that it has 14 phalanges, 5 metacarpal bones, 8 carpal bones. We consider the 2 forearm bones as well. You kind of add all that up, and that's more than 50% of all of the bones in our body are just contained within our hands and our feet. So, with that, we need muscles that help to control all these things. We need stability in all of these joints to allow for that motion to be able to take place. So, one of the big points that I wanted to make on this slide here, again, we've talked about the forearm bones. We talked about those last week. We also we talked a little bit about the carpal bones. We talked about those just kind of in general, like being kind of one region of the body. We'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of those today, but there's 8 of those. The metacarpal bones, just like we talked about in the foot, in the ankle, right? We said the tarsal bones, or the metatarsal bones in that particular case, were the ones that sat right next to the tarsal bones and kind of made up like the brunt of like the midfoot, right? In the hand, the metacarpal bones kind of do the same thing. They make up the brunt of the middle of the hand, which of course we all know as being the palm, right? So we can kind of once again see a lot of similarities between the feet and the hands. And speaking of those similarities, the phalanges themselves are the exact same. We don't even differentiate the names of the phalanges, whether it comes to the hands or to the feet. But just the same way as we saw in the feet, we have 14 phalanges. We have 3 on every finger, or in the feet it was every toe. But we have three on every one of our actual fingers, and then our fifth digit, or actually it's our first digit, but the last digit that we have here is our thumb, and that only has 2 phalanges in it. So have you ever heard like one of those kids always ask like, how many fingers do you have? And you say 10, and they go, no, you only have 8 and 2 thumbs. Technically they're correct. It's kind of an annoying argument to have with a child, and I had to have that with my nephew not too long ago, but it does end up happening sometimes. So that's neither here or there, but yes, 14 phalanges on either side, and like I said, there's really no differentiation between that. So if you're discussing the phalanges, you want to make sure that you get the rest of the context of that sentence to know if you're talking about the hands or the feet. Usually it'd be pretty obvious, but just kind of a little aside to kind of go with there. When we talk about the carpal bones specifically, there are again 8 carpal bones that we look at here. And this right here, the order that we're taking a look at, if you take a look on the picture, it's a little bit difficult to see on the picture right here, but essentially these bones are ordered from proximally, so the first 4 that we see here, the scaphoid, the lunate, the triquetrum, and the pisiform, right? Those are the more proximal of the 8 carpal bones, and they are running from, if we're again in the anatomical position, they run from lateral to medial. Trying to get the camera there. They run from, oh my god, I can't do this today. They run from lateral to medial, right? And then the next 4, the trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate, also run from lateral to medial, but they do so in the more distal row. So there's 2 rows of 4 bones, of course, equaling 8 of these carpal bones. And as the names go in this particular order that you're seeing on the slide, that is being named, like I said, from lateral to medial. First row is proximal, second row is distal. Because we try not to make people just strictly memorize these things, we do come up with different mnemonics. I learned this one by watching the medical TV show House. I don't know how many of you have seen that or not, but I love this mnemonic: scared lovers try positions they can't handle. I always thought that was hilarious. So of course, with any mnemonic, the first letter of each one of those words kind of represents the order of these bones, and hopefully helps to remind you of each one of them. So as we've talked about in this class before, I'm not the biggest fan of asking you to memorize everything, but this particular slide is definitely really going to help you as you move forward. If you're looking into getting in any sort of rehabilitation zone or anything like that, it's good to be able to know each one of these bones. Now, I'm going to move on here. I might go back. Okay, cool. So when we take a look at the joints, right, there are a ton of different joints. Pretty much on this picture that you're seeing right now, in between every single one of these bones that you're looking at, we can consider there to be a joint there, right? So the most obvious ones that we're taking a look at, if we go from most distal to most proximal, again, taking a look at the top of this particular picture, those are the most distal bones. The bottom of the picture is the most proximal ones. If we take a look at the top of these bones, the top of this picture, the distal bones, they're kind of easy, right? We see that there's 2 phalanges. We have the distal most phalange, and then we have what we call the intermediate phalange, right? So the distal most is right toward the tip of the finger, intermediate's the second one in. Between the 2 of those, we have the distal interphalangeal joint, right? There's a joint there. Same thing as we get down to the next one. There's another interphalangeal joint in these 4 fingers. There's just a single one in the thumb right here. So we have 2 in each one of these. We always have the distal interphalangeal joint, and we have the proximal interphalangeal joint of each one of our fingers, right? And of course, 3 phalanges, 2 joints. We again take a look at the metacarpal phalangeal joint as we kind of get a little bit more proximal. That happens in the thumb as well as the other 4 fingers. And even when we take a look at, we have the carpal metacarpal joints, right, which are between each one of the metacarpals and the carpals. Again, we've talked about the names of the bones and how that all kind of works, but we also can see, and we're not really going to get into this too much in this particular class, but we can also see that, of course, for example, the trapezoid and the trapezium, they're 2 different bones within the wrist, within the carpal section of the hand. Those 2 bones have an articulation between the 2 of them, and there are ligaments that happen there. The scaphoid and the lunate, another very popular example. There's something called the scapholunate dissociation, which is essentially those 2 bones kind of spread apart from one another. So again, we want to think about the complexity of this area of the body and all the ligaments and everything like that goes into all these different parts, all these different joints. So like I said, we're not going to get too much into each one of these joints in this particular class. We want to talk about more about the movement of the hand and wrist as a whole. But just know that, of course, there are all these different joints that kind of come into play here. When we take a look at the motions of the wrist specifically, and that's what we're taking a look at here, right? We see radial and ulnar deviation. We did talk about this a little bit last week, but if you remember from last week, we can see if we're in the anatomical position. A little difficult for me to show you here, but essentially the radius kind of sits proximal to the thumb, so it's more on that side. So in the anatomical position, the radius is on the lateral part of our forearm, and the ulna is on the medial part of our forearm. Right? So we take a look at that and we say, okay, if we have something called radial deviation, we are moving, try to angle my hand here, sorry, moving toward the radius. So we're moving our whole hand toward the radius. As we bring that into anatomical position, right, that would be, you can't really see it from this camera view, but if you try to do that on your own as you're watching this video, you once again get yourself in anatomical position, move yourself in into that direction, and that would look kind of like abduction, right? Ulnar deviation, the exact opposite. We move it toward the ulna. That looks more like adduction when we get it into in an anatomical position. Now, when I'm going to be talking about these different motions in this particular lecture, I'm going to be using the terms radial deviation and ulnar deviation. That's the way that I learned it. That's the way that made more sense to me. That's the way that we're going to be discussing it. But as we get through these pictures, you're going to notice that it's actually going to talk about abduction and adduction. So I wanted to kind of put this slide onto there to make sure that everybody kind of understood that radial deviation and abduction of the wrist are the same thing, right? Well, abduction of the hand in that particular case, they're the exact same thing. So just when you're taking a look at that pictures, I want to make sure you're not getting confused at that, right? The wrist is also capable, it doesn't say it here on this slide, but the wrist is also capable of performing flexion, which is as we kind of move our hand, again, in the anatomical position, the hand will be moving forward, but we're kind of moving our hand closer to the anterior aspect of our forearm, and extension is when we go the other way, right? So wrist flexion, wrist extension. You guys might have done this at the gym at certain times, but that's definitely something good to pay attention to as well. So the wrist has those 4 different motions: flexion, extension, radial, and ulnar deviation. Meanwhile, the interphalangeal joints in our fingers and our thumb, those can pretty much only perform flexion and extension. They don't have the capability of performing ab and abduction, right? So if we did have, any sort of motion in any direction, right, that would be, something that might cause an injury, hurt one of the little collateral ligaments that sits on either side of the finger, cause yourself like a jam finger, whatever the case may be. But the interphalangeal joints only have those 2 motions. The metacarpal phalangeal joints, they can also flex, right? Kind of like that waving bye-bye kind of thing. But then we can also spread our fingers and make our fingers closer together, right? So flexion and extension of the metacarpal phalangeal joints, but also, once again, abduction and adduction, right? And all this is just to say that there are a ton of different motions that we have the capability of performing in this particular part of the body. So before we actually get into the muscles, one of the things that I wanted to point out here is we're going to see a couple of different terms, right? Once again, not the biggest fan of memorization, you know that, but this slide is definitely something that is going to be very important for you too. If you need to pause the slide here so that you can read through each one of these, it's going to be very important for you to help you understand the rest of the muscles that are kind of coming up here, right? So whenever we talk about digit, or you see the word digitorum or anything along those lines, we're talking about the 4 fingers, right? Not the thumb, because when we're talking about the thumb, we use the word pollicis. If you remember down in the feet, we use the word hallucis that referred to the big toe. So it's just kind of the same thing, just talking about a different part of the body there, right? So we have the pollicis, we have the digitorum, or the digits, but then just to make things a little bit more, a little bit fun, right? We have the digiti minimi, which is the smallest digit, what we've all, of course, called the pinky, right? So we have the digiti minimi, and we also have the indices. We talk about the index finger, right? So we have, special names, as we'll see, because there are special muscles that help to control both of those particular digits. When we talk about carpi or carpal, we've already kind of discussed that. That's the wrist, right? Anything to do with the wrist. So whenever we talk about those, you can kind of see that how it's going to control different parts of the body. The other set of words that we have on the side here, these are once again opposites. We've talked about these before. So we see a longus being a long muscle. Whenever we see the word longus, we can pretty much rest assured that there will also be a brevis with that same name. And we'll talk about that here as we get into the muscles themselves. So longus and brevis, long and short muscles. And then we know the term superficialis, right? A superficial muscle. But then we talk about the opposite of superficial, and if y'all remember from the first week of class, it was deep. Don't know why they didn't come up with a better name for that, but in this particular case, we have profundus, right? So we have superficialis and profundus once again being opposites of one another. So if you see the term profundus, chances are you know there's going to be a superficialis one as well. So understanding this, again, if you need to write this down, make sure that you pause it right here and take a look at this slide. But we're going to move on here, and we understand this, and just from that, you should know a whole heck of a lot about the muscle that I have right up on screen, even though you can't see it, right? The word flexor digitorum profundus. We think about what that actually means, right? So flexing the fingers, we know happens with like this, right? So we know that that's the case, and we know, of course, that flexor digitorum means that we're flexing just the four, other fingers and not the thumb, right? So we're just kind of doing this motion, or I can just kind of do one of these right here, right? Being able to do one of those. Now, if you do that motion on yourself, if you flex your fingers, you can actually feel down in your forearm how those muscles are actually contracting, right? So what we also want to think about is not only what this muscle is, but maybe where this muscle is, right? Anything, as we've talked about throughout most of this, especially the upper body. Whenever we talk about the upper body, we talked about like the anterior deltoid muscle, it being on the front, and when it shortens, it's going to pull us into flexion. Our biceps brachii, that's also on the front of our body in the anatomical position. That is going to pull us into flexion. The same thing applies for, flexing the digits. That muscle is going to sit on the anterior side of our hand. So now, again, without seeing this muscle, without knowing the origin and the insertion points and all that kind of stuff, we know that this muscle sits on the front of our forearm. It flexes our fingers. And we see the word profundus, meaning that if there is a profundus muscle, there's also a superficialis muscle. So just by looking at those words, we've learned a whole heck of a lot about this muscle anyway. And when we bring up the picture, we can see exactly what we just talked about, right? It sits on the anterior side of the body. It helps to flex the fingers. But as we've spoken about in the past, we know that whenever a muscle crosses a joint, it will work on that joint. So flexion of the fingers, we can see how far that muscle runs, and we can see that that also means that it's going to flex our wrist. It's also going to help to flex. When we talk about fingers, we can differentiate here and see that the muscle inserts on the base of the distal phalanges of the four fingers, right? So that means that it crosses over both the proximal interphalangeal joint and the distal interphalangeal joint, meaning, of course, that it works on both of those. It also will then cross over the metacarpal phalangeal joint, the MP joint, the CMC joint, and just the wrist joint in general, right? So we can see that throughout all of that, it controls 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different joints just from this picture right here. One of the things that we will note is that this particular muscle, the flexor digitorum profundus, does not cross the elbow joint. So we will see from, in future pictures that we have other muscles that do cross the elbow joint, and those ones would work on the elbow as well. But in this particular case, it does not do so. It stays, it only originates from the ulna. So, we're not going to be able to see that for this particular one. As we were just talking about crossing multiple joints, it's going to act on every one of those joints that it actually crosses. So we just kind of talked about this, but it'll flex all those different joints within the hand as well as flexing the wrist. When we take a look here, my apologies for a little bit of extra text on the screen right here, but when we take a look right here, we can see this now is the flexor digitorum superficialis, and we can see that this muscle also crosses several joints. It does not come down and actually insert onto the distal phalanx. It only inserts onto the middle phalanx, meaning that it doesn't cross the distal interphalangeal joint and therefore doesn't act on it. But what we do see is instead this muscle does go all the way up, and it originates beyond the wrist joint. It originates more proximally than the elbow joint. So again, when a muscle sits on the anterior side of our body and crosses the elbow joint, we know that it does flexion of the elbow as well. So we can see that this particular wrist joint, or this particular forearm muscle, right, not only controls all the fingers, as the name would suggest, the flexor digitorum superficialis would suggest, but it also crosses the wrist, helps to flex the wrist, and it crosses the elbow, so it helps to flex the elbow as well. And a big point that I want to make right here, you can kind of see it just underneath my camera, like right, hold on, gonna point to it right there. All right, I'm getting better at this whole camera work right there. Right, you can see that little point right there, right? That origin point, we can see as it says right there, it's what we call the medial epicondyle, right? So if you feel in your forearm, I'm sorry, right up above your forearm, like at the really distal part of your humerus, where your elbow joint is, if you feel there, you're going to feel two bumps that sit off of the side of the humerus, right? Those are what we call the epicondyles. And as we've spoken about in the past, any sort of condyle or tuberosity also kind of comes here. That's something that we talk about as a part of the bone that muscles or other parts of or other connective tissue will attach to. Right. So in this particular case, that medial epicondyle is going to become quite a theme of all the different things that we'll be talking about in this particular lecture, as will in the next part of the lecture when we talk about the extensors, as will the lateral epicondyle kind of take place, right? So we're going to bring those back up. I just wanted to point that out for the time being. We're going to talk about those in a little bit after we get beyond the rest of these muscles here, but I just want you to keep that in the back of your head. So when we talk about the anterior musculature, one of the big themes that you can see throughout all of these things is the word flexor, right? Anything on the palmar surface, which is the anterior, if you're in an anatomical position, that's the anterior side of our forearm and hand. Anything on the anterior or the palmar side is a flexor, right? We can see flexor carpi radialis, flexor carpi ulnaris. We're going to get into all of these, but again, I shouldn't even need to change this slide for you to learn a bunch about where these muscles are. We've already kind of pointed out that they're in the anterior compartment, but we can see that a flexor carpi muscle, right, is going to work on the wrist. Now, if you do remember from one of the last slides of our last lecture, this is a really important point to make. All of these muscles are named for the most distal joint that they help to control, right? So when we take a look at the flexor carpi radialis, what joint we know that that's going to work on, or at least the most distal joint that we know that it's going to work on, is that carpi joint, right? And remember that the word carpi means wrist. So the flexor carpi radialis and the flexor carpi ulnaris, they're going to terminate just beyond the wrist, so they're just going to help to flex the wrist. They are not going to get down to work into the fingers or the MP joints or whatever the case may be. Meanwhile, the digitorum muscles, they will help to flex the fingers. We don't have a differentiation between the distal and the proximal interphalangeal joint. Those are things that you just be able to see in the pictures as we kind of scroll through them. But they will help to control the fingers. And the same thing for the flexor pollicis longus. We know that, of course, it's going to flex the thumb. And if there's a flexor pollicis longus, then chances are, and you would be correct if you've already assumed this, there will also be a flexor pollicis brevis, right? So we'll talk about that as we go on as well. So by this point in the semester, you should be able to kind of look at these pictures and understand a whole heck of a lot about what's going on about them. So I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time talking about each one of these muscles individually, but I just do want you to take a look at the origin point for both of these muscles and see that it's the exact same one that we've already discussed, that medial epicondyle, right? A lot of these flexor muscles are going to attach right there, and that's going to be important for another part of the lecture that we'll discuss in a little bit. But you can see, once again, we have the flexor carpi radialis, and we can see the word right next to the hand of the flexor carpi radialis, you see the word abduction, right? Remember from an earlier slide that we said that abduction can also be called radial deviation, right? And that's the word that I'm going to be able to use, or that I'm going to use throughout this lecture. So the radialis also performs radial deviation. The ulnaris also performs ulnar deviation. So you do see abduction and adduction. If you were to say that, you'd be totally correct. But again, I just want to be clear that I'm not going to be using those terms throughout this lecture. As we get into the flexor digitorum profundus and superficialis, A, we've already spoken about both of these muscles, and B, once again, I want you to be able to already read these things. So the big difference that I want to talk about between these two, which we've already kind of pointed out, is that the superficialis, which is the picture on the left side here, only goes to the middle phalange, whereas the superficialis goes all the way to the distal phalange. So they will control different interphalangeal joints. And we see on the flip side of that the superficialis originates on the medial epicondyle, so it helps to control the elbow, whereas the profundus does not. Right, so I just want you to kind of take a look at that right here. You can see that there's words on the picture to help label that, but just please make sure that you're noting which one is which. So just kind of an important point to be able to make there. And then last but not least, for the flexors that come from the forearm, we see the flexor pollicis longus. And again, the big point I want to make here is that it doesn't cross the elbow. So while it will help to work with the wrist, as well as the MP joint and the single IP joint in the thumb, we that's all it's going to be able to do. It's not going to work on the elbow. When we move on to the dorsal or the posterior muscles, you once again see a theme that arises from all these different muscles right here. They're all extensors, right? Anything that's going to come along the back side of the arm, the posterior aspect of the arm, is going to work with extension, right? Now the question is, which joints does it extend? So we once again think about the most distal aspect. So we see there's now 3 carpi muscles. We have an ulnaris, we have a radialis brevis, and a radialis longus, all of which do extension. So we already got that. We have the extensor digitorum as well. Now the extensor digitorum in this case actually does move into the thumb. You notice that there is no extensor hallucis, at least in this particular slide. That's a much smaller muscle we'll talk about in a little bit. But here we have the extensor digitorum, but then we also have the extensor indicis and the extensor digiti minimi. If you remember correctly, the extensor indicis is going to be talking about the index finger, and the extensor digiti minimi is going to be talking about the pinky, right? So the fact that we are able to make this kind of like rock-on symbol is because we have those extra muscles. I don't know why they're there, couldn't tell you, but it does mean that we can do this, which is kind of fun. But once again, we get into here and we see now there's a few extra ones right here. So moving from left to right, we see that we have the extensor carpi radialis. We have the extensor carpi radialis brevis. So extensor carpi radialis longus, the extensor carpi radialis brevis, and then we have the extensor carpi ulnaris, right? Now, all 3 of these muscles, as you can tell, they come up and they pass over the elbow joint on the posterior side of the body. Meaning that not only do these muscles help to extend the wrist, and they also help along with the ulnar and the radial deviation, but they also do help to extend the elbow as well. All right? Moving on from there, we have the extensor digitorum. So this picture doesn't actually show it going into the thumb, but once again, there is a tendon that goes into the thumb as well. But for the most part, again, what we're looking at here, the extensor digitorum, is really important to be able to help control the extension of the fingers. It also does cross over the wrist. We get extension of the wrist, and it attaches onto the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, by the way, as do these 3 muscles, all in the lateral epicondyle. But we see that the lateral epicondyle this time around, but because it crosses the elbow, it once again performs elbow extension as well. Not the main mover, but it does be able to help out with it. Now, different from the rest, we see that the extensor indices and actually, I'm sorry, that one does cross the elbow joint. But we do see the extensor indices doesn't cross the elbow joint. So that one only works on the fingers as well as the metacarpophalangeal joints as well. And the digiti minimi, why do we have this really nice long muscle that just helps to extend our pinky? I could not tell you, but it's there, and it also helps to extend the wrist as well as the elbow itself. So as we can kind of see, all of these muscles, and this is the reason that I was kind of kicking the can down the road last week, all these muscles are what we would consider to kind of be our forearm muscles. And when we think about the forearm muscles themselves, we would think, wow, the biggest thing that they help to control is the forearm. And that's why I wanted to try to differentiate this between 2 different lectures, because as we can tell now, that's not really the case, right? All of these muscles, once again, are named for the most distal joint that they help to control. And that's going to kind of tell us the reason that we put this into the hand and wrist lecture as opposed to the forearm lecture. That way we wouldn't really have much to talk about in this particular one anyway. So that's why we kind of made that differentiation. But you can see just the sheer amount of muscles that we have both on the anterior, the palmar side, as well as the dorsal side. You can see all those muscles that we have in our wrist and hand, in our forearm, that help to control all the fingers, which once again allow us to be able to do all those different crazy motions with our hands. Just the different tug of wars that happen throughout all these things allows us to be able to do so. Now that we've kind of talked about the forearm muscles, we're gonna just briefly get into the muscles specifically of the hand itself. So none of these muscles are actually going to pass over the wrist joint. So we don't get any control of the wrist joint from any of these muscles. But we have 3 different ones we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the lumbricals, and then we're going to talk about 2 different kind of sections of our hand here. So we have our thenar eminence and our hyperthenar eminence. So we're going to get into that in a second, but we're going to talk mainly about the palmar side of our hand, because that's where a lot of these muscles are contained. So when we get into the lumbricals, you can see on the picture right here where they actually kind of exist. They exist within the palm of our hand, and they only cross over the metacarpal phalangeal joint, right? So what we can talk about is, if you've ever, there's a term that you might have heard before called the lumbrical grip, right? And if anybody's ever done rock climbing, this might be a very popular grip that you've had to do in the past, where you don't necessarily have anything to grab onto with your fingers, so you just kind of have to use the entire surface of your fingers and the strength within the MP joints to be able to allow you to make any sort of movements. Now, any of the muscles that we've spoken about so far, except for the carpi muscles, any of the other muscles that we've spoken about do cross over the MP joint. So it's still going to be a very forearm intensive exercise. But we call this a lumbrical grip because the lumbricals, that is their pretty much their main job, is to be able to help flex the MP joint itself. Now that does help to perform a little bit of abduction and adduction of the fingers. It does help perform that as well, but the main action that it does is to be able to help kind of flex our MP joints. So that's why we kind of call that the lumbrical grip. Moving on from there, we see the thenar eminence. Now, this is, if you look at the palmar aspect of the hand, we can see that there's two main kind of muscly parts of our hand. We have the one that kind of is associated with the thumb. That's this kind of big piece of meat right over here. Then we have one that's associated with the pinky, right? So again, we get a lot of control of our pinky for some reason. It's kind of fun. But then, we have a lot of control of our thumb. Any of the control from our thumb that comes within the hand itself, it comes from this muscle group called the thenar eminence. And once again, we're just going to take a look at the names of the muscles that we see on the slide right here, right? We see the flexor pollicis brevis. We see the abductor pollicis brevis. And we see the opponens pollicis. All those words, of course, have pollicis in them, right? So we know that it controls the thumb specifically. We have flexion, which is where we kind of can pull the thumb out in front of us, kind of along those lines right here, right? We get the flexion that kind of does this. We get the abduction, which actually pulls downward and a little bit farther out, right? And then we have the opponent's muscle, which allows us to be able to kind of come in and touch any one of our other fingers right here. We've talked. You've probably heard in the past that what differentiates us from different animals is that we have opposable thumbs. A, this is what that muscle is talking about, and B, there's a lot more that differentiates us from other animals. But one of the things that does happen is the fact that we have the ability to oppose our thumb. That's the motion that I'm talking about here. As I reach my thumb across the rest of my hand, allows me to actually pick something up and move it between my fingers, right? Being able to kind of hold it in my hand like this, that's all thanks to our opposable thumbs. That's where that kind of myth comes from. But yeah, that's exactly what happens right there. So we have those three muscles that are very important within our thenar eminence that help to control the very smaller, the smaller, more minor motions of our thumb. And as we've already spoken about, if we have a brevis muscle of these, we also have a longus muscle of these. So we didn't get into, the abductor pollicis longus, but there is that muscle that also exists. So I want you to also think about, as you're reading these words, we see the opponent's pollicis, there's no extra words, right? So we know that that's the only muscle that kind of helps to oppose our thumb to come across. Now, because we do get a decent amount of flexion and adduction that comes along with that, other muscles help out with that, but the opponent's pollicis, that's kind of its main job. Did I have this? Oh, and sorry about that. I had this slide seemingly duplicated. All right, so disregard the slide that you're currently seeing right now. This is not the hypothenar eminence. This is the same slide as the one beforehand. Please disregard this one, and instead we're going to move on to the actual hypothenar eminence. And right here, we see that it's as the slide says, it's similar to the thenar eminence. The only difference is now we're talking about control of the pinky as opposed to control of the thumb. So these muscles tend to be a little bit smaller. They tend to be a little bit weaker. Of course, our thumb tends to be stronger than our pinky for most people. But we once again see the flexor digiti minimi brevis. We, of course, have a flexor digiti minimi longus, if that would be the case. So we didn't talk about that one today, but again, I want you to kind of think about that. We have the abductor digiti minimi. That's what kind of pulls our pinky a little bit farther away from the rest of our hand. And we have the opponent's digiti minimi, which, as it did for the thumb, allows me to be able to make that motion with my hand right there, right? Where I can kind of touch my thumb to my pinky. The rest of the fingers don't have that opponent's muscle, so they rely more so on the lumbricals as well as just the flexor muscles to be able to perform that motion. But we can really reach across the rest of our hand thanks to the opponent's muscles in both our thenar and our hypothenar eminences. I don't know how to pluralize that word, but so we have those right there. And then one of the last things that I want to talk about for this particular lecture is we did want to talk a little bit about nerve innervation here. Now, we haven't talked about that very much throughout the semester, but we're not going to be talking about all the where each nerve innervates what muscle and all that kind of stuff. We're not going to get into the weeds about that, but what I did want to show you here is one of the most specific parts of how nerves kind of innervate both the actions as well as the sensory aspect of our hands and any part of our body, really. So we can see this top picture right here. We have different color coding for each and every one of these, these different nerves, right? So when we take a look, for example, we're going to look down at the bottom picture here. We can see that both the median and the ulnar nerve kind of run more so on the anterior or the palmar surface of our entire arm. And as such, we can see that if we look at the picture up top, we can see that the median nerve controls a lot of the palm of our hand, and the ulnar nerve controls a little bit of the palm of our hand as well. But it only controls 1.5 fingers of that, right? Both the control and the sensory, most importantly there. We can also see that the radial nerve is pretty much only present, a little bit, you can see from the anterior aspect, but pretty much only present on the posterior aspect of the hand. So when we think about this, we think about, of course, one of the most infamous injuries, if you can use quotation marks there, that any one of us can get, and that's hitting our funny bone, right? Now, I'm not going to tell you all to do that now, because that would be dumb. But if and when it does happen to you in the near future, I want you to think about where you actually are feeling most of the tingly sensation that happens from that, right? Because when you hit your funny bone, what you're actually hitting is your ulnar nerve. It runs right on the backside. I'm going to move my sleeve out here. You can see, remember the olecranon process, right? It moves right on the medial aspect of our olecranon process as it moves down and into the forearm on the anterior side, right? So it's really well exposed right in that area. And whenever we hit our funny bone, it's usually because we've hit right around there, right? When we do that, if you think about what sensations you're actually feeling, you're never going to feel hitting your funny bone in your thumb. You're never going to feel it in your index finger or in your middle finger, right? You're going to feel it a little bit in your ring finger and a lot in your pinky and a lot into the back of your hand, kind of along that whole, hypothenar eminence, getting down into the distal radius, the distal ulna and all that kind of stuff as well. So when we take a look at this, you can see on that top picture, all those yellow sections in the top picture, that is the ulnar nerve. So when we hit our ulnar nerve, which we've called the funny bone, when we hit our ulnar nerve, that's what we see is that same kind of pain response happens right where all those yellow sections are and not where the blue, red, or brown sections are. So, it's definitely kind of an interesting thought process when we take a look at that, but that's what we see from these nerve innervations. So putting everything that we've talked about together, what we want to talk about now is, again, one of the more infamous sections of our injuries that we could get, which is the carpal tunnel, right? Carpal tunnel itself is not an injury. Carpal tunnel itself is an anatomical structure. What we talk about when we actually have the injury or the pain associated with it is carpal tunnel syndrome, right? So when we take a look at this, we can see this green section that we have in this top picture is in fact the carpal tunnel, right? It is all of this space that we have between our carpal bones on the posterior side and a ligament that holds all the carpal bones in a proper shape on the anterior side of the palmar surface. And in the middle, we have quite literally a tunnel that kind of gets formed through those sections. So when we take a look at this, we can see that there is one nerve that exists within the carpal tunnel, and that is the median nerve. So if we go back to this, if anybody has carpal tunnel syndrome and it's affecting the median nerve, we can see that that is the blue section here. So that's quite, especially on the palmar surface, that's everything except for that innervated by the ulnar nerve. So we can see that if you have carpal tunnel syndrome, chances are you're going to have pain in the blue section of the hand. of this picture, of course. So when we take a look at that, we can think to ourselves, well, why does that happen? And I have it right here on the slide. When the flexor tendons of our hand, right, flexor digitorum, flexor digitorum profundus, superficialis, digiti minimi, pollicis, all the different ones. There's no digiti minimi, but all the different ones that we can see from this. All of those muscles will come in and they will they go through this carpal tunnel. If those muscles, or if those tendons of those muscles get irritated, if they get inflamed, if the muscles themselves are too tight and they're always kind of pulling on that area, what happens is the median nerve begins to run out of this green space. That green space gets relatively smaller, and all these flexor tendons begin to push on the median nerve. That, of course, irritates nerves. Nerves don't like that, and that's what ends up causing the pain in the blue section of the hand. So we didn't really get into, in this particular course, you'll learn about this a little bit more in biomechanics, but we didn't necessarily get into ways to kind of help shut down really tight muscles. But I'll just kind of give you the answer for this particular one into saying that whenever we contract the muscles on the opposite side of the body, then we can kind of help to calm down the muscles that are a little bit too tight. So a lot of times what we'll see is for people with carpal tunnel syndrome, one of the best treatments that they can do for it is to kind of start doing wrist extension or forearm extension exercises. That's going to help to work on all the muscles on the posterior side, all the extensor muscles, which, as we've talked about, is kind of the opposite of all the flexor muscles. So as we're doing that, you're going to help not only strengthen the posterior side, but you're going to kind of help loosen up, kind of relax a little bit more the anterior side, the anterior muscles of the body. So in that process, what you're going to be able to do is reduce the intensity of the contraction on those anterior musculatures, and that can start to calm down the inflammation of these tendons. You can start to get a little bit of stretching in there. Of course, any inflammation, you can kind of put some ice on there too, and all those different things, but different exercises and stretches. And that's what's going to allow us to start to work with, a less severe version of carpal tunnel. If it gets too bad, what they actually end up having to go in there and do is cutting through part of, if not the whole, transverse carpal ligament. And that's not necessarily a good idea. People don't tend to want to do that, so they usually tend to prescribe physical or occupational therapy before they get to that point. So there's a couple of different exercises that you can do. Again, when we get into the biomechanics aspect, of the second kind of portion of this two-course platform that we have kind of going on, you'll learn a little bit more about how we might be able to kind of harness that situation to make sure that, we can prevent injuries or heal up from injuries as well. So, but we just kind of want to talk about the way that the muscles themselves and the tendons move through the forearm, the wrist, and the hand, how they insert, and what that might end up doing to some of the nerves. So, just kind of a little, thought experiment that you have right there. But I think it does help to go to show what, how we can actually use muscles to help heal up other parts of the body as well. So kind of a little nerdy thing that we talk about there. But with that said, that's going to be the end of this particular lecture for today. Go through, take a look at this if you need to watch it more than once. I know we kind of move fast through a couple of portions of this, but make sure that when we take a look at everything here, I want to make sure that you guys don't have any questions about these things, or if you're not confused about anything that I said today. So if you do have any questions, again, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. As soon as I am getting into service and I have the ability to answer those, I will. But go ahead and take a look through all these things. Any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, remember that next week you guys should be watching this. Hang on here. Pulling up my calendar. You guys should be watching this, I believe, on November 6th. Yes, I believe you're watching this on November 6th. Take a look at the syllabus if I'm wrong with that date, but I'm pretty sure that's the date that you're actually watching this. So if you're watching this on November 6th, next week, November 13th, is our second midterm. So please remember that. I'm going to have a little reminder set up that should get you reminded of that. But please remember that your second midterm is next week. So take a look at everything here. Everything from when we talked about the heart and the circulatory system all the way up until this slide is fair game for that one. And then the following week after that, we will be back in the classroom, and that's what we'll be working on our practicums as well. So by this point, you should have been able to see the little study guide I will have made for you for the practicum as well. So go ahead and take a look for that in the modules. If you don't see that, just go ahead and let me know, and I'll make sure that everything is posted correctly and everything. But yeah, take a look at that, because when we get back into class, I will have all of your different sections and everything like that all set up, so that you'll know what time you're coming into class and when we're doing all that. So any questions, like I said, let me know. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time, and I'll see you guys in a couple weeks. Thanks. Bye.